Hi everybody, welcome to my top 15 favorite female fantasy characters video. A few things first, this will be a loosely ranked list leading up to my number 1 favorite female fantasy character. Number 2, recency bias does play a role. I don't think there's any getting around that when it comes to a ranked list. Number 3, there will only be one character per series and author. And number 4, the majority of characters and series I'll be talking about are adult fantasy and adult fantasy characters. Shout out to Hermione anyway. I love that character and the Harry Potter series when I read it so many years ago. But yes, the majority of books I'm going to be talking about will be adult fantasy, with the exception of maybe a few that might blur the lines between older YA and adult. And part of that has to do with the coming of age arc where the character starts out very young in the first book and then matures as you go on in this series. First, I'll start out with honorable mentions, and I'm going to mention a standalone book called The Golden Key. This is an epic fantasy standalone that I read several years ago based on a friend's recommendation, and it was written by 3 female fantasy authors, Melanie Ron, Jennifer Robertson, and Kate Elliott. And what I remember about this book is that it was told in 3 periods. It is reminiscent of Spanish history in a secondary world with art magic, and that in the 3 periods we have 3 very detailed female characters that I remember thinking at the time were probably written individually by each female author who wrote the book. So I think this book is worth a shout out, even though it's been some time since I've read the book and I don't remember details. I do remember again that the female characters stood out. My next honorable mention goes to the character Naylin in the Queens of Renthia trilogy by Sarah Beth Durst. Now, this is a series that is sometimes marketed as YA and sometimes marketed as adult, and I think the ambiguity happens because of book 2 with the introduction of Naylin, because book 1 focuses on a young female character, whereas book 2, the character of Naylin, is a woman in her 30s. She's the mother of 2 children. She's in a less than ideal marriage at this point, when she's presented an opportunity for leadership, which she is very reluctant to take on. And I think that a lot of female readers in fantasy will enjoy this mother representation in this very whimsical, wonderful forest setting fantasy trilogy. And I know that the character of Naylin leveled up my joy of reading this trilogy. Now on to my official list, and I'm starting out with Éowyn from Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. When I finished Lord of the Rings so many years ago, I remember being drawn into Éowyn's conflicts as a female in a fantasy series that is very male-dominated. She has some struggles regarding her gender and her desire to be a fighter, and she plays an incredibly important role in Return of the King. There's a lot to be said about the aftermath of Return of the King, what happens towards the end with her character. And if you want a great in-depth analysis of this character, I'm going to highly recommend that you check out Jess of the Shire's video. She did an amazing look at Éowyn, book Éowyn versus movie Éowyn, and talked about the differences. And there's a lot to unpack with that character, and I think Jess of the Shire did a phenomenal job. So I'll go ahead and link that video in the comment section below. But if you've read the books and watched the movies, then you will definitely see what she's talking about. And this is a character that I think deserves a lot of attention, again, because of her role in that story and in a series that is very male-dominated. Next on my list is Emily Marshwick from Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a flintlock fantasy standalone that deals with a war situation that becomes so desperate that not only men are drafted for this war, but women are as well. Emily Marshwick is a genteel woman who ends up joining the ranks of women in the military. So this not only deals with women in the military, it deals with social class, it deals with propaganda. And what I really appreciated about Emily's character is the way in which we see her transform from the beginning of the story and her interactions with her siblings to who she becomes as a result of the military, as a result of war, and what she learns along the way. There's a bit of a love triangle in this story, which I've talked about before, and there are also some gender tropes that I think are subverted in a playful way, and I thought that the ending was very satisfying. So I read this book twice. I read it visually the first time, and I listened to the audiobook the second time, and I have to say that I found myself more attached to Emily the second time I read it. I think Emily Marshwick is a standout female military character in fantasy. Now to talk about Vasilisa or Vasya in the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. This is a Russian folklore historical fantasy trilogy, and Vasya at the beginning of the trilogy is quite young, and she's struggling with the patriarchy in the culture where she lives. She escapes into the forest where she gets in touch with the magic there, as well as a horse animal companion. And I really appreciated that her journey is one of fighting to be herself, fighting for her independence, while at the same time learning to let go of control at times. There are some heartfelt sibling dynamics in this trilogy, and I just love that Vasya was such an independent, fiery type of character. She marches to the beat of her own drum, and she reminded me of people I know who are very dear to me. Fans of the Winter Night trilogy might also enjoy the Arrows trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. Now, the character of Talia in the Arrows trilogy is very different than Vasya in the Winter Night trilogy, though they have some things in common. So, Talia in this particular trilogy is someone who grows up also in a very oppressive culture towards women. She is expected to marry a man at a very young age and be one of several wives who serves her husband for the rest of her life. She escapes this fate one day when a companion, a magical companion that very much resembles a horse, comes and finds her and helps her escape to a magical school setting. So this particular trilogy starts out kind of wholesome with the magical school setting and the whimsical magic and the heartfelt relationship between Talia and her companion Roland. And the series gets quite a bit darker as it goes on. Now, whereas Vasya is very fiery and independent, as I mentioned, Talia is very cautious. She is on a journey of trust. She has to learn how to open up to others, learn that it's okay to depend on others, to connect with others. And I just really enjoyed that journey for her. I enjoyed this trilogy quite a bit. And another thing to mention about this character that made her very dear to my heart is that she sings in this series, and there are songs dedicated to her that she sings. With a series name like Gentlemen Bastards, it might be clear that Scott Lynch can write excellent male characters, and he does, but he also showed that he can write excellent female characters with the introduction of Zamira Drakasha in Red Seas Under Red Skies, Book 2 in the Gentlemen Bastards series. Zamira is a pirate ship captain. She's a mother of two. She runs a tight ship, and she has strategic skills and leadership skills that come through in her dialogue. I loved her character so much that I think she's the main reason that Red Seas Under Red Skies is my favorite of the Gentlemen Bastards books published so far. And I hope that if we get more books published in this series, that we get to have more of Zamira. Vin from Mistborn makes my list as someone who reminded me a little bit of my younger self when I read this trilogy so many years ago. So Vin starts out with a much harder past than I did, though. She was a street child. She comes from a broken home when Kelsier recruits her to learn about allomancy and to join his plot to overthrow the Lord Ruler. But when she first comes into his group of friends, she feels a bit like an outsider. She's a little paranoid, a little cautious. She's not sure she can ever belong in this group. And little by little, she learns that she can. She learns to find confidence in herself and to grow into herself and to connect to others. And I loved her journey of growth. She's a character I often refer to when someone says they want a fantasy series or trilogy where they see a character grow from book to book. My next choice goes to Amat Kian from the Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. Daniel Abraham is also one of the authors of the Expanse series, and when I read the Long Price Quartet, I noted how well he wrote not only young characters, but older characters as well, not only male characters, but female characters, and Amat Kian is an older female character. She uses a cane to get by, and she's introduced as someone who knows what to say, how to speak as being her main strength, and that comes through in her dialogue in this series, and it plays an important role in her part of the story. And I appreciated that as an older character, she's a little reclusive when we start out with her, as she's lived her life. It's not as easy to get around in older age, but she still has a deep love of the place where she lives, of Sariket, and certain circumstances that happen there cause her to have to go outside her comfort zone. So I think she's an excellent elderly female character who shows her wisdom, who shows her experience through the years. Each character I'm talking about on this list comes from a standalone trilogy or series that I've completed or I've read every book that's been published so far for the most part, but I'm making an exception for the next character because I haven't finished this series yet. It's an 11 book completed series and I'm only on book 6, and that is the Wars of Light and Shadow series by Jenny Wirtz, and the character is Illyra. Illyra is introduced in book 1, Curse of the Mist Wraith. She is introduced as a very young street child turned initiate enchantress. She's an herbalist, and she matures so much from book to book. I have deeply attached myself to Illyra's character because I feel her conflict. She is put between a rock and a hard place so many times in this series, and I deeply feel what she's experiencing. She has a bit of a romantic connection with another character in the series, which is amazing, and she shows a depth and understanding of love in a way that I don't feel like I've often seen in fantasy. So there is time, of course, for me to change my mind. I haven't finished the series, and she may make it higher on my list after I finish the 11 book series, but I have to mention her now because I am living for this character. She is one of the main reasons I look forward to picking up a Wars of Light and Shadow book. The next character I have to talk about goes by a few different names in the same series. She has a few different aspects to her, and that is going to be Susanna Detta Odetta from the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. So this is a character who was introduced in book 2, The Drawing of the Three. She's a Black woman from the 1960s, and she adds disability and mental health representation to this series. But beyond all the trauma and afflictions she endures, she is a character who comes off the page. She has so much personality, and she does have some passages that are very difficult to read about, but I think she adds so much to the quartet, to the found family between Roland the Gunslinger, Eddie Dean, Jake, and Oi. I love her so much that I even enjoyed book 6, Song of Susanna, which I think is an unpopular opinion, but I think that this series would not be the same without her. My list would be incomplete if I didn't mention Mizaki from The Sword of Kaigen by Emma Wong. This is a character who is a mother, and while she appreciates being a mother, there is so much to her identity that she wants to realize beyond the role of wife and mother. And certain conflicts that happen in the peninsula where she lives causes her to have to confront those aspects head on. Now, when I read this book so many years ago, I was not crazy about the flashback sequences regarding this character, but there is a case for them adding layers to this identity conflict, and I can't deny that Mizaki is one of the most inspiring, admirable characters in all of fantasy. Like Scott Lynch, Abercrombie proved he can write excellent male characters with his earlier books, including the original First Law trilogy, and of all the female characters introduced in later installments, Savine is my favorite in the Age of Madness trilogy. Bald, sassy, great business acumen, haughty, like all Abercrombie characters, she's put in situations that test her personality to the max. Of all the characters on my list, Savine might be the most hilarious and the most entertaining. I enjoyed her so much. Esmenet from the Prince of Nothing trilogy is one of the most fascinating yet difficult characters to explore. She's difficult to explore because she's a prostitute in a very misogynistic world. She's marked, she's tattooed as such, and she's treated brutally as a result. She also tries to understand the world more through the men she sleeps with, and she goes through a really difficult experience after having a child. So she's a character that Baker put a lot of care and attention into, but she is understandably a difficult character to read about. Yet I could not look away. I found this character very impactful and compelling throughout my experience of the Prince of Nothing trilogy. Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson is one of those series that would have multiple entries on this list if I were to choose multiple characters from a single series, but the one that I choose might be controversial. It is Tavor, and the reason this is a possibly controversial choice is that we never get Tavor's perspective in this series. We only understand her through the perspective of other characters, whereas there are several amazing female characters where we get their inner dialogue, we get their inner thoughts. We don't really understand Tavor except through how other people understand her. And she's a sister, she's a leader, she's constantly being questioned by those around her. She's constantly being tested and questioned in her position. I find her interesting to look at in comparison to another character that you may have heard of if you've heard of this series, or you may know about if you've read it, Animander Rake. With Animander Rake, we also never get his perspective. We never get his thoughts in the series. We are made to know about him through the perception of other characters. But Rake has this level of mystique going for him. He's a Tistandi. He has this really cool sword called Dragnifer. People tend to respect him in this series. He's quite adored. Whereas Tavor, like I said, is constantly being questioned. And I found that I, as a reader, had to construct a portrait of this character as I read the series. And the portrait that came together is one that I love. I've never wanted to jump into a book and hug a character as much as I've wanted to hug Tavor. She won my heart. And maybe if you've read The Crippled God, maybe you'll understand why. And if not, I guess I'll be alone in that decision and I'll happily stand by it. The Lions of Alverson by Guy Gavriel Kay was my introduction to Guy Gavriel Kay, and I immediately became attached to the character Jahan, if I'm saying the name right. Jahan is a female physician in her 30s, and she's also of the Kindath religion, which is the most oppressed religion in this story. As a result of being a physician, she's very intelligent and she's very professional and boundaried. And as a result of being a little older, she's not super young. She knows her way around the quarters where she lives. She's very street smart. She's on a journey of love, of friendship, of adventure. She starts out a little tough, a little hard around the edges, but she learns to let people in. She learns to let people care for her as she cares for others. And I appreciated her sense of humor. A lot of the male characters, I think, find her quite sexy, attractive, but she just added so much to this story, in my opinion. And a lot of people these days say they want more women in fantasy who are ages 30 and up. And to that, I say, why are you not reading Guy Gavriel Kay, especially with the character Jahan in The Lions of Alverson? Now for my number one favorite female fantasy character, Cersei Lannister. I love this character so much that I made a dedicated Cersei video. It has spoilers for books 1 through 4 in A Song of Ice and Fire, but I do a Cersei skit and then I go into reasons why I find her such a compelling character. And this is a character who is cruel, condescending. She has delusions of her own intelligence and leadership skills. She has an ancestral relationship with her brother, and yet I lived for her chapters. I'll also add that A Song of Ice and Fire was a very meaningful series for me as a fantasy reader because it's the first adult epic fantasy series where I saw multiple female characters, where I got so much great representation. In fact, I was a guest on the Bend the Knee podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to A Song of Ice and Fire. It's hosted by Jamie from the Fantasy Network and Matt. And in that episode that we talked about A Feast for Crows, Matt pointed out that if you look at the POV breakdown, if you look at the chapter breakdown in A Feast for Crows, you'll notice that the majority of perspectives and chapters go to female characters. I didn't even notice that when I read the series the first and second time, but upon reflection, that was important to me. And it makes me wonder how many female readers were brought into the genre who were made to enjoy or love epic fantasy as a result of what Martin did in bringing so many female characters into this series. And again, shout out to Erickson for doing that in the Malazan series. Of course, I didn't discover that until much later, Erickson and Esselmont, I should add. But it is meaningful to me to have female representation in epic adult fantasy. And I'm sure it's meaningful to a lot of female fantasy readers out there. That is it for my list. Please let me know in the comment section below your favorite female fantasy characters. Please consider liking the video if you liked it. It helps me out a lot. Subscribe if you're not subscribed if you want more content from me. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.